a little MacGyver going on over here.
Yeah. So you got the setup.
Well, we'll see. Let me just send out the links real quick.
Okay. And about how long we're going to sort of kind of organize the bullet points? About how long do you think?
We can go back and forth, maybe like 20, 30 minutes, and then also hopefully get some input from them and
let's do
play
that.
by ear. I mean, I know everybody's going to want to eat, so.
Yeah.
All right, let's see here. There you go.
MashaAllah. So that's streamed to like Facebook, or?
I'm gonna.
That's streamed to like Facebook.
I'm gonna send it out right now. Let's go here on Facebook. So I'm gonna just put it on Facebook and Twitter.
Okay.
At Diane, but it was specifically the Laverne.
Oh, you went to the one that.
Yeah. Was it tomorrow? It was not too long ago. Yeah, it was I'd say it was less than a year ago. But it was almost a year. Yeah. That was like, it was a nice lecture. Yeah, it was so much. And that lecture, he went over like so much in such a short amount of time. Like, I kind of tied it all in. I'll probably be seeing him next weekend. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. And then just put it on Twitter.
Yeah, so he got married in November, now he lives in the same street that Monster Truck is on, pretty much. Yeah, so I think it's Lincoln. You exit Lincoln and you go north to the freeway. He actually lives on what is it? Segovia. Street that so over there. Yeah, he actually works all the way over there.
Oh wow.
But it's kind of in between for him and his wife. Yeah, it's not.
All right, so I think
Wasn't he living like? Yeah, he was living. No, he was working in Glendale.
Oh, so that was.
And he was living with his wife. They live in San Gabriel area. And then now he's officially has his apartment with his wife. Yeah, I went for the first time about 2 weekends ago to the apartment. It's nice. It's very mellow.
all right, so enough of all the technological tomfoolery. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. Thanks for coming out through all of the inclement weather. So inshallah today we have a special guest, Imam Khalis Rashaad from the Ibrahim Center in Houston. And while our food is getting ready, we wanted to have a little talk. And I want to preface this by saying that this is going to be the very, very, very condensed short version, because this is a conversation Imam Khalis and I have been having for a long time, over the phone, over WhatsApp, over text, over Twitter. And I decided to kind of frame it and say, you know, why should race even matter to Muslims today, right? So there is a lot of activism going on within the Muslim community about certain matters that, you know, pertain or relate to race. And therefore I thought, well, being that we're, you know, in so-called Black History Month, would be to ask, why does that, how and why is that? You know, is it important? And if it is, in which way is it important that we should discuss or have this conversation? So please welcome our guest, Imam Khalis.
Assalamu alaikum.
You can clap too, yeah, okay. I know. I don't know what it is, man, about Muslims and clapping, man, but we need a committee. We need like a Muslim committee on clapping to finally once and for all determine whether or not it's permissible, man. Because it's those like pregnant pauses where it's like, man, this is a tough room, man.
Yeah.
So to open up, why should Muslims, you know, should we be talking about race? Sometimes, and I'm sure you've heard it, I'm sure people here have heard it, there's no race in Islam, right? We'll hear that kind of thing where, you know, and why is it, do you think some Muslims might have that attitude? Is that the attitude we should have? And if not, why not, and so forth, you know?
This is like a big piece of meat, and you don't know where to start chewing. So just to answer the question, I think race is important. It's something to be discussed. You know, this verse in the Quran in Surah Al-Hujurat, we created you into nations and tribes, لِتَعَارَفُوا, so that you may know one another. And some of the translators put in parentheses, and not despise one another, right? So the races, nations, and tribes. Then there's another verse that we recite when we are given nikah, when we are wedding people, that also speaks about in our races and in our colors, there are signs from our Lord, right? And so, in one sense, yes, we talk about race. Race is, we should be, this is not a matter of pride in the sense of arrogance and beating our chest, but more so a sense of gratitude, right? Allah made each of us. We're different, but technically we're not that different, right? In terms from a DNA perspective, we share about 99% DNA, right? The way we look, skin, wide noses, eyes, whatever, that's a matter of climate, migration, and all of that. But it so happens that throughout history, people have used race as a means of subjugation, of subjugating others, right? And I think we'd be hard pressed to find any group of people whom that have been used against more than people of African descent. So I think, yes, we should discuss race. I think sometimes what's the dialogue in the, if we can call it a dialogue, in the Muslim community today, we tend to go to extremes, right? So I mean, that's a natural human tendency. We have this tendency to just be drawn to extremes and things. And so one extreme is you have the communities who say this is not something that we're going to discuss, right? If it's not talking about Palestine, Kashmir, Muslims in China and all of this, we don't want to discuss it, right? And so that was a gripe of mine for a long time, was as an imam being invited to speak and to attend fundraisers and galas, and these are important concerns about other groups and other nationalities. But when it came to talking about, the black man that's shot down in the street by the police, it was silent. But now the tides are turning a bit. Now Muslims this is a conversation that's happening in our centers and in our spaces, and Muslims are becoming more and more concerned. And then we have the other extreme. And I want to try to put the best construction on it and say the intentions are well, but of course the other extreme is that's all people want to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Right. Where race becomes almost like a preoccupation. Right,
and it's spoken about in a way it's secularized, right? Mm-hmm. And when we talk about, read, and understand race in our tradition, first and foremost, it's okay. Well, how do we make this a dini thing and rather than a dunya thing, right? Rather than something that's egotistical and has become so secularized, where we've stripped the religious nuances out of it and everything, and it is just about this.
We talked about that this morning in the class, actually, about there's a challenge we have, I think, as an American Muslim community in particular, because one, our language that we're all going to mutually communicate in is going to be English. And therefore, when we're talking about, religion in general, or even Islam in specific, a lot of that language has already had such a deep footprint implanted upon it by Christianity. Mm-hmm. So we were saying this morning, like, you will hear Muslims that will freely use the word saint for like a person who is muhsin, mm-hmm. or a person who is a wali, like essentially a pious person, mm-hmm. right? Except that just simply doing a copy and paste of the Christian Judaic usage of saint, particularly Catholic, right? And just sort of copying and pasting that into the American Muslim document and saying, okay, we can use the word. I mean, that word does have certain, uses and implications specifically in Christianity that we actually might be very uncomfortable with, right? Like, we don't believe in calling on people to do intervention and, all these other things. So when it comes to race, I feel like we need to actually do a bit more of our own homework, not to go to the one extreme of, well, there's no race in Islam. Well, there's a whole bunch of things that aren't in Islam, so to speak, right? But race can be a concern of Muslims. Mm-hmm. However, we do need to do a bit more intellectual due diligence to make sure that when we talk about it, it reflects ultimately our values as Muslims, that it coincides with the Quran and with the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ and so on and so forth. So now that we kind of have that out the way, we can maybe say, okay, for sake of argument, race should matter. But in what way, and what should we, if we can, what should we do about it? Should we just simply be incensed about racism? And should we also be lulled into thinking that, well, every issue, especially if we're going to talk about in the context of Black Americans or African Americans, is every issue, I'm not trying to go the Larry Elder route here, but is every issue that is confronting Black people today, Muslim or non-Muslim, can it always be boiled down to simply racism? Is there also not some degree of agency that is due upon Black Americans to lift them up? Now, Dr. King said famously when the white journalist interviewed him, like, shouldn't Black people essentially pull themselves up by their bootstraps? And he said it's a cruel joke or a jest to tell a bootless man to pull himself up by his bootstraps. However, there seems to be very little discussion as I've seen, especially as of late in the Muslim community, around the sort of like activist discussions around race, that still wants to put a level of responsibility on black folks of like, okay, yes, white supremacy is real, structural racism is real, but what are you doing? And we seem to be very uncomfortable with having that conversation. It's much more comfortable to sit on our proverbial pajamas and kind of lament about white supremacy and our lack of agency. So I don't know if you have some.
Yes. So and right. I was just going to say that I need to probably preface or really try to be careful in terms of how I articulate this, because people will misunderstand where you're coming from, and this is something that I've personally evolved on over the years, and so activism to me, because I was deeply entrenched in it 15 years ago. So yes, I was. But I say that when I see some of our activism today, it kind of make me hang my activism up. It's like,
for what reason?
Going back to, it's nothing sacred about it anymore.
Right. Imam Walid actually just put out a book called Towards Sacred Activism from an Islamic perspective and so on. Yeah.
And then it just became about screaming, photo ops, taking pictures. Let's make sure that the camera is right here and get this angle of the handcuffs on me, and I make sure that my shirt says this and certain. I know pictures and videos, they have a way, the power of gaining people's attention. But when I saw those things,
they also miss a lot too.
Right, they also miss a lot. So that's one side of it. And then I think through growth, personal growth, obtaining much more wisdom, and I believe just more knowledge, much more well-rounded, holistic knowledge, and going back and really studying people like Carter G. Woodson.
Now, for people who aren't familiar, who is he and why is he significant?
Yeah, so Black History Month was actually initially Black History Week, and Black History Week was founded by Dr. Carter G. Woodson. And this Dr. Carter G. Woodson, he's actually the second African American to graduate from Harvard University with the PhD. The first was W.E.B. Du Bois, right? And so Dr. Carter G. Woodson, he's someone, his parents were slaves. And so think about someone in the early 1900s, Black American, had written over 30 books already, written in several journals. And so I would say that his seminal work was a book titled The Miseducation of the Negro. Back then, Negro was the term that was used for blacks or Black Americans. And like Dr. W.B. Du Bois, his seminal work would probably be The Souls of Black Folk. Again, he was a historian, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, and so he believed that it's important for a people to really understand their history so that it will give them a certain level of confidence to move forward. And so he's the founder of, and so the reason why February 7th was Abraham Lincoln's birthday, who was the author of the Emancipation Proclamation, but also February 14th was Frederick Douglass's birthday as well. And so he put the Black History Week or Negro History Week during this time right here. And subsequently, I think it was 1971, 72 that it became Black History Month, right?
So, when you look at some of these earlier figures, Carter G. Woodson, people of his era and before, there seems to be a different tenor, a different tone of those folks who were interested in Black upliftment that, to quickly summarize, seem to be more about the legitimate empowerment of African Americans to be self-sufficient.
Right, right. And
Or
so
a lot of the activism today, while we don't deny that people are rightfully incensed by injustices and so on, I tend to question, okay, sure, I see things. I mean, personally, I've had 2 near-death experiences with the police, right? So even being as light-skinned as I am, I've had to deal with the reality of racial profiling and how that can essentially be a fatal interaction. My concern is that it doesn't go beyond pandering to the emotions, and that also the issue we have is not only anti-black violence. Most certainly at one point in time that might have been our predominant challenge. But now that we have moved away from where it is overt state-sponsored, I mean, we still have this residual institutional racism that sometimes we have, like with the police and other things, right? But now, for instance, our predominant challenge might be both morality and economics, and those two can be intertwined, and yet there's very little conversation amongst modern black activists that really deal with the economic issue. It tends to be a lot of emotional pandering.
Right, right. And that's basically what I was going to say. When we read Dr. Carter G. Woodson's works, when we read Booker T. Washington's works, and Booker T. Washington got a lot of flack for his time, but yes, in terms of...
And why would he have gotten a lot of flack?
Because he was more so about economic and moral upliftment.
And he was a pragmatist.
And he was a pragmatist.
He realized that, you know, it might be more beneficial and more realistic for you to get trained as a carpenter or some kind of skill. You might not be able to go from slave off the plantation to business owner overnight, especially given that essentially the structure of slavery never really went away. Right. So it might be more beneficial to you realistically, to your family, get a trade, and then begin the slow process of that kind of upliftment.
Carter G. Woodson speaks about this in his book, The Miseducation of the Negro. Booker T. Washington speaks similarly about it in his book, Up from Slavery. 2 good books that I really would recommend people read. And it's just kind of like, it really is this do-for-self type of... Right. It's basically, a lot of the activists today, I want to make 2 points here. It seems as if we're saying that black Americans cannot move forward until racism is at 0.
Right.
Or until white supremacy is at 0.
And it's also
or until all the wrongs that have been done have been righted, and then we could move forward.
It also gives the misconception that the only problem we face is white supremacy. That if we could proverbially wave a magic wand today and do away with the problem of white supremacy, all of our problems as well would be solved. As you and I know, that is very, very far from the case.
And so just as a practical level, I have the privilege and the honor of mentoring numerous young people, Muslim as well as people of other faith traditions, all different ethnicities. But I want to focus on my mentorship with black Americans, youth as well as families. And one of the things that I always ask is when the person is constantly looking out in terms of about the system, and we know the system is broken, right? And so some of the first questions I ask is, okay, what about you? Let's bring this down to a micro level, right? What time did you wake up this morning? Right. If you're trying to close the wealth gap, right? Why are you late for school every day? Right. Why are you? You know, where's your discipline? Let's start on the micro level. Right. Of really, where you're from. Why are you wasting money?
Right. Essentially, where's the agency? Like what part do you play in your own upliftment?
And so, discipline and morality is a lot more difficult and a lot more challenging than just...
And it also might be much more efficacious. Like it'll have a greater degree of impact on your life by dealing with your self-discipline, self-mastery, and your morality. You know, there's a tradition from Imam Ali radiallahu anhu, where he talks about that one of the causes of fiqr, of poverty, is zina, is fornication. So, you know, for us, we have a certain insight, and that's where there has to be a degree of honesty, I think, for Black Americans, for us to have, is that we need to look and say, yes, undoubtedly, like I'm from Detroit, right? It's kind of like ground zero for redlining. For those who aren't familiar, you know, redlining essentially was an economic practice by the banking institutions that that both gave out loans but also influenced how property values were determined. And they were able to draw lines, you know, these municipal lines throughout cities, where essentially white houses were able to appreciate in value, and black houses were essentially forced to depreciate in value. And given that the typical way that most Americans historically have moved up the economic ranks was predominantly through the equity that they had in their homes, and that it was the primary way that, for instance, whites were able to pass along generational wealth to their descendants, or take out equity in the home, send their kids to go to college, right? So like my family, we had to give up our house because the neighborhood was just absolutely a beast, right? The violence was so bad. Nobody's going to come into that neighborhood to buy a house. But then also through the process of redlining, the banks would not approve blacks for getting a loan where they would approve whites. So it helped to fuel this phenomenon called white flight, right? So we again, there is absolutely
right. We're not.
There's no argumentation against the existence of structural racism and its tangible impact on black life.
Right.
But it is not a destiny-defining impact, right? So to bring it back, like there's this verse in Surah Al-Isra where, you know, where Allah instructs the Prophet ﷺ to say, "Qul Rabbi, you know, adkhilni mudkhalan sidqan," right? Say, Ya Muhammad, say that, oh my Lord, right? Open up for me a sincere way. A sincere way in, wa akhrijni mukhraj sidqin, in a sincere way out, waj'alni min ladunka, you know, nasiran, and to make for me this way of agency, power, sultanan, nasiran, make for me a way in or out. So to bring it back and kind of how do we just, you know, not just to have a secular conversation about race, but as you said, to sacralize it, to make it sacred for us as Muslims, is that part of our da'wah, part of our inviting people to Islam, is inviting them to the agency that God bestows on all of his ibad, on all of his worshipers. And that no matter how dark or difficult times may see, we always have a way in or a way out with Allah. So even if we are dealing with structural racism, we still have an obligation towards self-mastery, self-discipline, right? And in this, we actually can gain agency where instead of seeing no way out, and therefore I'm just going to go down the rabbit hole of hedonism, I will confront those challenges and those fears, and with the help of Allah, with the aid of God, inshallah, you know, God willing, I can overcome them.
Right. I mean, when we're studying things like critical race theory, some things about it I agree with, some things I don't. But or studying about the system or the history of racism. I mean, you can go and go, but it still eventually will come back to yourself. And so one of the points that I always make is, as long as most African Americans, in terms of the degrees in sociology, the degrees in education, right? This is what African Americans, Black Americans tend to major in, right? Gender studies, psychology, sociology, and education. Yes. Hands down, the most of the majors, right? Well, we're never close to wealth gap. I mean, just as a practical, you know, that's just as a practical, we would never close the wealth gap if that is what we're going to college and those are the only majors that we have. We will constantly be begging at the feet of the white man if this is if this is what we're doing. Right. And so for me, it's like, okay, well now, entrepreneurship, right? Or just aspiration. Like, if your goal is to close the wealth gap, or if your goal is to, you know, home ownership nowadays. it's not necessarily, people are not using their home as ways to build their wealth anymore. That was something that they realized, it's much more of a liability nowadays than it was.
Right.
And so you have to focus on, like, okay, well, perhaps today, most of our quote unquote power, or that shouldn't come from straight political activism.
Yes. Because in fact, if we look, and I feel like I'm at the, I don't know, I'm on the danger of sounding like Michael Steele or Larry Elder or Thomas Sowell at this point, but very seriously, if we look at the political aspirations, and even more importantly, the fruits of those aspirations in the black community, especially post-civil rights, we need to do some serious head scratching and go, you know, show me the money, show me the progress, show me the results of all this, because I'm just not seeing it. Matter of fact, you know, maybe we can connect it to what we were talking about last night in Vincent Lloyd's book about race and secularism in America, is that you can't really have this other conversation about race with also talking about secularism, because secularism has wanted to play a very managing role, right? Secularism, for the, you know, if you're not familiar with this term, it's essentially, let's just call it the state. It's like governmental power, the state. It also tends to mean non-religious authority. So in Western societies, the state likes to be the only, you know, author, interpreter, and executioner of the law. And therefore, it doesn't like a lot of competition. It wants to be able to do whatever it wants to do and doesn't want to have a whole lot of critique. Historically, the two biggest critics of secular state power have been not only racial minorities, but religious racial minorities. So most of you are familiar with Dr. Martin Luther King. What is interesting about Dr. King's legacy is that he is portrayed now as like a humanist, that Dr. King fought for the rights of everybody. This could not be a more covert and subversive attempt to rewrite somebody's narrative so that we buy into this, right? Dr. King was not a humanist. He was a black Baptist preacher, and his whole reason of putting skin in the game not only was because he personally or his family members, you know, faced, you know, the onslaught of white supremacy and the violence and whatnot, but he felt that he had a God-given right as a preacher in particular to speak out against injustice. So his whole reason, and therefore his language, was all religious. But it wasn't just as a black person, it was also as a Baptist. It was as a Christian. He felt, I have an obligation as a Christian to speak out against oppression because it's against my religion, it's against my theology. And yet predominantly the way that we have been coerced and massaged to understanding and appreciating Dr. King's legacy is this humanist. And I'll read a brief passage from the book here where Lloyd talks about when, you know, after his death, Ronald Reagan was the one that actually enacted the legislature to make Martin Luther King Day, right, a national holiday. Now, what's interesting, Reagan saw him as somebody that, you know, stood up again against oppression and white supremacy based upon the 10 Commandments and so on. So he saw him very much. Now, you fast forward, you know, 30-odd years later to the first black president, Barack Obama, and see how he talks, right? So he says, in unveiling the King Monument, Barack Obama also carefully managed his deployment of the language of religion and race. Obama hailed the, quote, slow but certain progress brought about by King, because the progress, people of all colors and creeds live together, work together, and fight alongside each other. So all of a sudden now, instead of Dr. King fighting for his people, and not fighting against some like unknown quasi-transcendent power or something invisible. No, he knew Dr. King and that movement, they knew exactly who they were fighting against. They were fighting against the state, because it was the state. It wasn't like what we have now where you have like people in these Make America Greater hats going around and being like vigilantes. No, back then, it was what? The police. This was state-sponsored violence against, right, blacks. Barack Obama comes along and wants to erase all this because, in the end, and to acknowledge it is to acknowledge the state's involvement in the subjugation and the oppression of black people, which the state is like, no, 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 no. This is just against some generic struggle, right? So this is the challenge of secularism. And that it also, he says, the management of race and religion are not administered from some neutral ground. It continues the very specific religious and racial heritage of the United States. It's very, very American for the state to manage both religion and race, which we tend to forget. We see the civil rights movement. I mean, probably most of us, I would ask you to raise your hand, you would think of the civil rights movement as being exclusively a black civil rights movement. No. I mean, these people were singing hymns, right? When he wrote his letter from a Birmingham jail, right? You read the language of Dr. King. It was religious language. So this struggle was not purely just race, it was also religious, which is why I think it's also, important for us.
Absolutely. And one of the things that come to mind was part of Dr. King's, he was also transitioning through his life in terms of, I think his ideologies were becoming more solidified, more crystallized. Toward the end of his life, you listen to some of the lectures, and he say things like, "I felt like I led my people into a burning house."
Right? Now, what do you think he meant by that statement, leading my people into a burning house?
Yeah.
What is the burning house?
I think the burning house was integration, forced integration.
Right.
And
so why would that be a problem?
Going back to economics, right? It's like, okay, well, what happens when black Americans are going to sit at the white man's ice cream shop and getting hosed down with water and getting hit over the head to spend your money at the white man's ice cream shop? Well, what's happening with black businesses if there's all this black flight away from black businesses? And so what it did was it created an economic problem, so nobody talks about how integration, or forced integration, contributed to the racial wealth gap, right? Because now, when we look at the 40s, 50s, and 60s, black businesses and economics, it was really, really progressing. Why? Because we were not allowed to go sit in the white restaurant, right? So now, forced integration happens, and so now it's chic and it's educated and it's highbrow to go and sit at the white man's restaurant and dress up, and so what was happening is that there was no concern about what was happening to
and even
black
further than
economics
that,
and
right?
black
I mean, it wasn't just only that, but because of segregation, however wrong it may have been, by it forcing black Americans to patronage other black American institutions, they supported them. What do we have now in every urban black center?
Absolutely.
We have all the businesses that are there, all the corporations that are there, from small business to large corporations, that are all almost predominantly owned by who? Non-blacks,
Absolutely.
but are patronaged by almost exclusively blacks.
Yes.
So the black dollar no longer circulates amongst African Americans.
There's a rant.
So while we understand that there is an evil, undoubtedly, to segregation, but Dr. King said, I'm concerned about integrating my people into a burning building, leading them to a burning building, that maybe we should have gone about. It's not that we shouldn't have gone about desegregation, but maybe there's a certain way we should have gone about it, especially given that the government was not going to see to the needs and the care of black Americans and business owners in the way that they did secure those for whites. I mean, in that famous speech by Dr. King, he told the reporter, I'm not asking anything from the government, that is due to me simply because I'm black and I'm looking for a handout. I just want what you gave to white America. Land grants, GI Bill, low interest. I just want the same thing because I'm an American citizen. But being that didn't happen, what's interesting, the military was much more successful at desegregation because it was the military and they just simply didn't allow certain things. My father was in the military, roughly around this point. And it was in the microcosm, like in the bubble of the military, it was a bit better. But once you came out into general society, it had actually this huge detrimental impact. So in a very short time, you essentially, black-owned businesses, because they were not allowed to compete on the same level playing field, they essentially failed. And this had a devastating effect.
Yeah, when I was growing up, of course, I grew up in the black inner city, say lower tier middle class, or some working class, and also poverty. And I remember the I call them inconvenience stores. They're not convenience stores, and they were predominantly owned by Arabs, Desis, and Chinese or Japanese. Right, that was predominantly, and everything that was being sold in them were things that were basically destroying the community.
Right.
So yeah, if you wanted your pornography, if you wanted your 40 ounces, if you wanted your and then the food, quote unquote, that they sold was, and so there were no grocery stores. Everything was food deserts, and they treated their customers. So you go in, there's a bulletproof glass, right? So there was no customer service. This is the way you were treated.
There's also a correlation. We don't have time to go into it, but there is also a direct correlation between the demise through forced segregation of essentially the black-owned businesses as models and how those benefited the black community, and how then as a result of that it created the illegal economies of illicit things, particularly drugs, right? So given the history of how, black, or the slaves and then their descendants were essentially criminalized, right? There was already this kind of like prejudgment that, well, when it comes to the blacks of selling drugs, it's due to their criminal nature, and it was rooted in this, racial hierarchy kind of point of view. But a lot of the development of the drug trade in America, particularly in the black community, was actually rooted in just necessity. I mean, how else were you going to, make a living? Because particularly at that time, 40s, 50s, 60s, if you were black, you couldn't join a union. Like, again, from Detroit. So, of course, Detroit used to be known as like the Paris of the Midwest. It was like this great jewel, and it was this great hope that for even just a blue-collar person, you could go get a job in a factory, and in a very short time, you could own a home, you could own a car, you could really uplift yourself, right? And the problem was it wasn't there initially for black folks, because guess what? You couldn't join the unions as African Americans. So, in long story short, this helped to very much contribute to the generation of an illegal underground economy that was very much rooted in drugs, not because people just wanted to be criminals, but it was also rooted in like, well, how else am I supposed to make a living and support my family, right?
Absolutely. These are the unintended consequences of good intentions.
Right.
And we have to study these things. And so again, how this, and I quote unquote forced integration, perhaps we should have went about it as a segmented type of integration or a purposeful integration. But yeah, I mean, if you're creating laws and you're forcing me to go to your school, or you're forcing me to, and all of these things, because the intention is racism and this would be better for the community. But again, it contributed, I mean, it was an economic catastrophe and an educational catastrophe. So even today, you go into the inner city, the schools are just not up to par at all.
Yeah. Now to maybe turn a corner, because we have a number of people here are not of African American background, right? And for people listening on the internet, right? So we've laid all that out. I want to draw an analogy between this integrating into a burning building, the mistakes of a misguided integration, right?
Yeah.
I would like to make an analogy between how that was a misstep for African Americans, and we've seen the negative results for that. I want to make the analogy between just the general Muslim population and integrating, right? Now, as Dr. Jackson has famously said, there's a very big difference between assimilation and indigenization. And for sake of argument, I would say integration and assimilation being like the problematic one, indigenization. Now, for those that if you don't understand these words, right, assimilate means you essentially join a group at the dictates of the group. So as we say, when in Rome, do as the Romans. Versus what Dr. Jackson has been saying is that, this is our home, we live here, but we need to go about determining our way of how we will integrate into it, right? Mm-hmm. And therefore, if we leave it up to the dominant culture to determine how we integrate, I'm concerned about how that could also spell disastrous implications for the American Muslim community, which is why I feel that the discussion about race is important. This is essentially for me to justify why we're having this conversation. This is why I feel like the discussion on race is important, not because I want non-blacks to care about the plight of black people, but there's a lesson that is going on that we need to look at that could have similar implications for our community. So we do see now, I'll just be honest, I mean, some of you might get incensed, but for instance, on Twitter, I think a couple of weeks ago, there's this new Senator Ilham Omar, the first Ethiopian Muslim woman in the Senate or Congress, Senate, right? Senate, right? Congress. So she famously stated on her Twitter feed about her support for the LGBT community and that there was nothing shameful about essentially being from that community, in that we know that community isn't just talking about people that have inclinations, it's also people who want to act upon those inclinations. So there is a danger of you just simply assimilate or integrate into that burning house. Okay, great, you got voted into the Senate, but at what cost? And what does that spell for us? Is that the price of admission? That if we integrate into America because, it's kind of like Allah says, لا تتخذوا اليهود والنصارى أولياء بعضكم لبعض. Don't take the Jews and the Christians as your protectors, not friends. This is a horrible translation. Nothing wrong with being friendly with people, but it's not appropriate for us to leave our rights, how we worship, how we practice our religion. It's actually irresponsible to leave that responsibility up to others than ourselves. But if we go the route of this assimilation, then we may wind up essentially, will there be anything left of our Islam, or will we have Islam that will be kind of like Black America today, that's almost like has pneumonia?
Yeah, so
you can put your knives away.
So let's take Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. For me, I could say that I wasn't appreciative of that. I didn't see the tweet, I've only heard about it. That as a Muslim, I would not have put it out there like that. But at the same time, I pray that there will be much more good that comes from her. And any other Muslim that is in politics, and I'm saying this because I work with politicians in my city on a local level, and I know that is it's not easy at all. And the last thing that personally I want to do is to begin to maybe start a movement or create an atmosphere that would make the good that they attempt to do 20 times harder. And so that's my take on terms of our politicians that may say or do things that I may not necessarily, that I feel like contradict my personal moral values, my personal piety. But again, I expect good things, the good that they do, our Muslims who are in politics, to be much more good. And then I think it would be problematic if we decided to say, well, we're not going to even be involved in politics, or I think that would be problematic as well. That's like saying we're not going to be involved in economics, we're not going to be involved in education, etc. We have to be there. We do need that seat at the table. Of course, we need to ensure that we're not on the menu and things like that as well. So,
but as you
that's my
said,
take.
one of the problems with that we can look at with the Black American model is there, especially post civil rights, there was all this emphasis and great hope placed upon black politics, right? And we've had numerous very famous, very vocal black politicians, and yet when we look to the boots on the ground reality of most black Americans, we don't see the beneficial impact because, in a sense, it's turned into a style over substance. That's my concern with American Muslims and politics. Again, not to go to the extreme of we shouldn't be involved in politics. I think that's an extreme case. However, we should demand not only from our politicians, morality or whatnot, but we should also just ask ourselves, I mean, what do we want from politics? Because there's this confusion, I think, not only amongst the Muslim votership, but also what are some of the Muslim politicians, like what are they selling? Because sometimes you'll have people that will come in the community when they want to get the Muslim vote, they speak in a Muslim voice. And then when they're not with the Muslims, they don't speak in the Muslim voice. And then are we expect, like, what is our expectations of politics? And if we want to be blunt, all people go into politics because they want some type of influence or power. Let's just be honest, that's why people go into politics. Is politics the only way to have influence and power and agency? So I'll for instance, how many Asian American politicians do you see? Name me a prominent Chinese American politician. You cannot find one. Now, we all live here in Southern California. It's very clear that the Asian American community has power and agency because they own a lot of what? Real estate. They are an economically empowered community. They tend to promote as a cultural value amongst themselves what? Education, self-discipline. They tend to have low numbers of teen pregnancy. So if we're looking for power and agency, perhaps we should see politics as just simply one tool in the toolbox alongside some other tools, and not simply let's put all our money on this one lucky horse and keep betting on it and betting on it and betting on it, and then keep losing over and over.
Yeah.
That obviously that horse has not produced results for the Black American community, and therefore for us we should perhaps think similarly. Should we put all of our money to ride on it, or should we also be looking at something else?
Yes. So let's take these. I think the sister Rashida and the sister Ilhan, they're congresswomen, and they are representing their constituencies. And so Minnesota, a lot of Muslims, I would think predominantly Somali, right? And she's elected because they have interests that they have in their particular state or vicinity or whatever, right? And so you need a representative for you the same way like Rashaad, right? Or same like if I ran for city councilman in my particular area, and I would feel like, okay, well, this is not being done in my community, and so I believe that I could step up and create relationships to send funding back there, or to send jobs there, or to send infrastructure, whatever the case may be, that would benefit the people that I am representing. And so that's who they are responsible to first and foremost. Right. Not the entirety of all the Muslims in the U.S.
Like putting a minaret on the state capitol, calling the Adhan. Right. I mean, just again, we have to be honest. Like, what is it that we want? We talk about politics, and we've been led to think, oh, well, everybody else is doing politics. Maybe we should do it too. Do we do it in the same way? What are our expectations from it? And do we understand the political system? Right. I know some Muslims. Well, I don't want to vote for a Muslim politician because they're going to also have to maybe support things that are quote unquote non-Islamic. Well, it's like, well, I mean, obviously there's no obligation religiously to have to do politics, but it also might be a bit short-sighted. It's like you're not living in a predominantly Muslim country. So it's also a little bit juvenile and ridiculous to expect that's what a quote-unquote Muslim versus instead of it being a Muslim politician, it's a politician that happens to be Muslim. Hopefully overall their general approach to their job is one of morality and moral rectitude in the same way that we would expect any other Muslim in whatever their job or occupation would be.
Right. And in politics, there's a lot of deal making, bargaining, give and take. And so, of course, on the outside, I could have this entire paradigm. But again, if you're not like in it, in the muck and mire, in the deal making, okay, well, if I give you this, then you would vote for this particular funding for my neighborhood or whatever. It happens. And again, we pray that the good that they do would certainly outweigh any bad or any bad that they may do. And Allah would, we pray that Allah will forgive them for any bad. But I think it's a mistake if we decide that we're just not going to go into politics. That's one of the four structures of a civilization. I would be afraid to see what that would look like in 50 or 100 years if Muslims were not in Congress or in Senate or in city council or mayors or whatever. So, yeah.
So maybe to conclude and then open up if there's any comments, is there anything you want to finish with, thoughts, things you want people to maybe walk away from, contemplate?
Well, I would say, we spoke about this book, The Miseducation of the Negro. There's a lot of lessons in that, in general, Muslims, we could also, lessons that we could get from that, but also an appreciation of history, art, all of these things. So Muslims, we tend to only deal in religion and economics, right? Whatever my job is, that's all I'm focused on. But we have to have, Allah says in the Quran, He encourages us to look to those who came before us. Sunan al-ladhina min qablikum, right? The history or the example of those who came before you. Why?
Right.
Because you're going to learn these lessons, and Allah uses this to push out lessons for us. But also with regards to racism, with regards to Black American, African American history, just an appreciation, a deep sense of gratitude for the people whose shoulders we stand on, right? The good job you have, African Americans opened that door. Without the Civil Rights Act, wouldn't have that. We wouldn't have some of the
protections
and the legal protections and the economic mobility that we have, had it not been for those struggles. So,
and Dr. Jackson famously said once that Black America is the Banu Hashim, right, for us here, right? And if you're not familiar, right, Banu Hashim, the Prophet ﷺ came from the tribe of Banu Hashim, and that even though many of them were not Muslim, they weathered the boycott and the difficulties that were levied against the Prophet ﷺ and the Muslims. So they stood with them, even though they were not, many of them, Muslim, and therefore the Muslims were protected by them and benefited from and were insulated from a lot of that hostility. So he said, in some ways, for us to give us an ability to have an insight as to, again, why would race even matter in America beyond the typical sort of secular tropes of it, is that, well, to some degree, if you make the analogy that Black Americans are the Banu Hashim, and it's true, by and large, out of all of the different ethnic groups in America, African Americans are not only the largest slice of the pie of American ethnicities that have become Muslim or are Muslim, but even for those who are not Muslim, they tend to be the most sympathetic towards Muslims. And it would, I don't get a chance to use this word very often, it would behoove us to appreciate the significance of that, because it is like it's like a seerah lesson. It's like a prophetic biography lesson that Allah Ta'ala is putting right in front of our eyes, for the pleasure, for the benefit of seeking his pleasure. So, so we'll open it up. The food will probably be ready shortly, or is. So, are there any? Oh, is it? It is. Okay. So, really quickly, are there any questions, comments anybody has before we break for food?
I think, living in New York City, one group that's kind of similar to us is the conservative Jewish group there. And they don't get directly involved, the conservative ones, but they keep the politicians somewhat in their back pocket by using their block, as a block vote, as a continued group as well. They have a lot of funding that they do, like through Adelson and all these people that they have. So I think that's some way we can learn from them as a group.
So we could benefit from maybe looking at the Orthodox Jewish model in New York of how they deal with politics.
In an area for Williamsburg, for example, they didn't want women to come there dressed in an unconservative fashion. They actually painted the bike lanes out. They got rid of the bike lanes so people wouldn't be wearing like short skirts riding their neighborhoods. And it got to the politicians, and within like a night, it just disappeared because they have all of the mayors, the county, everybody under their pockets, so they could take care of stuff like that. I'm not trying to be like,
No. I think your point is astute. I think the one thing that if we're going to, and it's true, I think for whatever reason, particularly American Muslims have allowed the Palestinian-Israeli conflict to completely cloud our judgment of understanding the American Jewish community. One thing that we definitely do see, and particularly amongst Orthodox Jews, is there is a willingness to be distinct. And that is something our community is still not 100% comfortable to be distinctly and unapologetically Muslim. We still are kind of always on the hunt for some shade or lily pad to kind of hide out, whereas we can see that, again, now we can go into the details whether that's a right or wrong thing to do, but there is a benefit that we can see in them that they have decided we are going to be a people and we are going to act together and have mutual interest, even though we know when you study not only just the Jewish community, but even the Orthodox Jewish community, there's differences of opinion, there's dissension within their ranks, but it only goes to a certain extent. So there is a lesson in that for us to look at, that one of the obstacles we probably will need to overcome if we're going to be successful is just being comfortable in our shoes as Muslims and recognizing not everybody is going to be happy about that. Clearly, all these years later, people are still not happy about the existence of Jews, right? Anti-Semitism is still a real thing, and yet, you cannot allow that fear to completely conquer you. So that is something to look at.
The Muslim community is too diverse. The Orthodox Jews are more homogeneous, so they can do.
We're too diverse, so basically everybody should just follow me.
Yeah.
I'll raise the flag of Khilafah. We all just follow. I mean, I'm good with that. Are you good with that?
Yeah, I think that's a good point that the sister makes, is in terms of the diversity in ethnicity, race, but diversity in economics, diversity in how we engage our Islam, how we engage our pieties, and so. Yeah, I mean, I don't see most Muslims as conservative as like the conservative Jewish community.
Just as most Jews are not as conservative as the conservative Jewish community.
And so one of our challenges could be, well, how do we navigate this diversity? And so I think some in our leadership would try to pull the reins on that and try to tamp it down. And I think you're fighting a losing battle. Doing things.
It's also not the first time and I think it just also shows our general unfortunate ignorance of history, that diversity is indeed a major challenge, but it's not the first time in Muslim history that diversity has been a major challenge. Matter of fact, we tend to, when we discuss the Muslims of Spain, right, the Moors, and we discuss Islamic Spain, it's often done with this great nostalgia and this romance and how beautiful it was, and you go to the Alhambra. It's true, it's all wonderful and beautiful, and yet there's a reason why it ain't here anymore, right? And one of the issues that they were challenged with, that they didn't pass the test on, how did they deal with diversity? Because you essentially did. In Spain, you had essentially people that were the indigenous Iberian Muslims, that converted, or their forefathers converted, and then you had the people that traced their lineage via North Africa, essentially back to, or at least, apparently back to the Arabs of the Hijaz, right? So this caused a division within them, that the bickering and the fighting and the lack of unity essentially grew to such an extent that the Christians came in like, you know what? This stuff is actually pretty nice. I like this Alhambra thing. I think I'll make it a cathedral. I'll take it off your hands for a very, low price. So we should also look to history and understand that we're not facing challenges that nobody has faced before. The scope of it might be different, but we see in the past before that diversity can be a challenge, even though when we tend to talk about diversity today, it's always championed as a positive. And it is a wonderful thing, but it is also going to be a challenge. So yeah, we need to also have a plan of how will we not get rid of diversity, because it's one of the signs of Allah is that we will make you different colors and different tribes and so on. So we should not work to go against the plan of Allah, but more accept His plan and realize that we are going to essentially have to agree to disagree. But if I don't agree to let you go eat, I think you're going to eat us. So since I don't want to be on the menu, Jazakumullahu khairan. If you have any questions, inshallah, you can come and holler at us while we eat. But we appreciate everybody coming out in the rain. And we also appreciate Imam Khalis taking time out from his busy life and schedule to come and illuminate us. Inshallah, please give him a round of applause, a halal round of applause. Jazakumullahu khairan wa salawatu wa salamuhu ala nabihi al-kareem wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah.